Mark Twain once said, "Too much of anything is bad, but too much good whiskey is barely enough." Hello, my name is Michael Sillo, and I've been working in the liquor industry since 2004. And one thing that I've come to learn is that not many people know that much about whiskey, but they sure do like to drink a lot of it. Now me, I like to think of whiskey as belonging to a family tree. Now today, I want to talk to you about 3 branches of that family tree: bourbon, Scotch, and Irish whiskey. Now bourbon, according to the American Bourbon Association, must be made in America. Must be made with at least 51% corn, and the other 49% can be more corn, rye, wheat, or malted barley. Bourbon must be distilled to no more than 80% alcohol by volume. It must go into the barrel to age at no more than 62.5% by volume and must be aged in 100% brand new charred American white oak barrels. Now, there is no legal age requirement for bourbon, but if a bottle of bourbon says that it is straight bourbon, it has to be aged a minimum of 2 years in that barrel. Bourbon cannot be bottled at less than 40% alcohol by volume. And bourbon, by definition, must have the flavor, aroma, and characteristics of a whiskey. Now, Scotch, according to Whiskey Advocate, has to be made in Scotland. Has to be made with cereal grains. Now, there are 3 subclasses of Scotch. There is a malt Scotch whiskey. Malt Scotch whiskeys must be made with malted barley. They are typically produced on a pot still, and a single malt Scotch has to come from a single distillery. Then there's grain Scotches. Grain Scotches are made with malted or unmalted barley, typically produced on a column still, and a single grain Scotch has to come from a single distillery. Then there is blended Scotches. Now, blended Scotch whiskey is basically a blend of 2 or more single malt Scotches or 2 or more single grain Scotches and just blended together. The Scotch Whiskey Regulation of 2009 states that Scotch must be distilled to no less than 94.8% alcohol by volume. Scotch must be aged a minimum of 3 years in oak barrels that are no larger than 700 liters. They cannot contain any additional color or flavor outside of water and caramel. And they have to contain the flavor and characteristics of the raw goods used in the production and aging of the whiskey. Scotch cannot be bottled less than 40% alcohol by volume. Now, Irish whiskey, according to Whiskey Advocate, must be made in Ireland. They have to be distilled from a mash of malted barley and other unmalted grains. There's 4 main subclasses of Irish whiskey. There is the malt Irish whiskey, which is made of 100% malted barley, typically produced on pot stills. There's the pot still Irish whiskey, which is made from at least 30% malt, 30% unmalted barley, and up to 5% other cereal grains. These are produced on pot stills, as the name implies, and a single pot Irish whiskey must come from a single distillery. Then there's grain Irish whiskeys. Grain Irish whiskeys have a maximum of 30% malted barley with other unmalted cereal grains. And then they're produced on column stills, and a single grain Irish whiskey must come from 1 distillery. Then there is a blended Irish whiskey. Much like blended Scotch whiskey, is a blend of malt Irish whiskeys, pot still Irish whiskeys, and grain Irish whiskeys. Now, the Irish Whiskey Act of 1980 states that Irish whiskey cannot be distilled any higher than 94.8% alcohol by volume, has to be aged a minimum of 3 years in oak barrels that are no bigger than 700 liters, cannot have any additional flavoring or coloring outside of water and caramel, and have to have the characteristics of the raw materials used in making and aging the Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey also cannot be bottled at less than 40% alcohol by volume. So in conclusion, we've covered bourbon. Has to be American made. Has to be at least 51% corn. Has to be aged in brand new American white oak barrels and cannot be bottled at less than 40% alcohol by volume. Scotch has to be made in Scotland. Has to be aged at least 3 years in oak barrels and cannot be bottled less than 40% alcohol by volume. Irish whiskey, you guessed it, had to be made in Ireland. Has to be aged in 3 years in oak barrels, no bigger than 700 liters, and has to be bottled no less than 40% alcohol by volume. So, after covering those 3 whiskeys, hopefully the next time you're out having a drink and you order a whiskey, you'll know a little bit more about what you're drinking and hopefully have a better appreciation. Thank you very much.